Don't waste extra wine. Make living wine vinegar. I'm Marcy McDonald of Pacific Northwest Suburban Homesteading. I'm turning this episode of Kitchen Science over to my friend Shonna.
It's tasty, it's healthy, and it's easy to make. Hi, I'm Shonna Zimmermann, and today I'm going to show you how to make living vinegar out of leftover red wine. You're going to start with a bottle of wine that for whatever reason you're not going to drink. Say for instance, you opened a bottle of wine at a party, but it didn't get finished off. Wine that's been open for a little while starts to oxidize. It starts to lose its color, it starts to lose its character, it just starts to lose its drinkability. Or for instance, you have some wine that was stored incorrectly. I have here a couple of bottles of very beautiful medal-winning Sangiovese that, through no fault of its own, was stored in temperatures not exactly favorable to wine, and I can tell you that it is no longer drinkable. We've also all heard the expression aged like fine wine, but that's only applies to certain wines. Old world wines from France, from Spain, from Italy, their viticulture and techniques cause these beautiful tannic structures to form in their wines that stand up to aging very well. So if you find a case of 1921 Châteauneuf du Pape from France, it's probably very drinkable. But domestic wines from the Americas are built and created more fruit forward. The tannic structures tend to recede into the background, and therefore they don't stand up to aging as well. You may have something from Napa, California that's 20 years old. It's going to start losing its structure. That is something that unfortunately must be sacrificed to the vinegar vat. You could also have a wine that you just don't like. If you open it and you taste it and it's not to your liking, you can use it for vinegar or spaghetti sauce, but that's a different video. Any wine works for this project. You can use red, you can use white, you can use rosés, even champagnes. You can mix them all together, have fun with it, and have a wonderful time coming up with a new flavor profile. Now let me show you a little bit of information on this wine label that is very important to your winemaking before we even get started. Hard alcohols tell you how much alcohol is in them with a proof system, which goes from 0 to 200. So 100 proof is about 50% alcohol. Wine goes by ABV, which stands for alcohol by volume. It will tell you on the label approximately how much alcohol is in this bottle, within a certain tolerance, of course. Most wines are between about 12 to 14% alcohol. The lowest range that you'll see is about 5.5% alcohol. The highest range you're ever going to see is about 16% alcohol. As a side note, if you're doing this project and you're using a wine that is 18% or higher, I recommend not using that. That's a fortified wine and it will give you results that won't be pleasant. As we all know, alcohol is used as a disinfectant. The amazing irony of winemaking, when winemakers are fermenting their juice that they've crushed from their grapes, they introduce yeast. It's very much the same as baking yeast or brewer's yeast that we're all familiar with. Its byproduct of its fermentation is ethanol alcohol. That's where the alcohol in the wine comes from. But as it continues to eat the glucose and the fructose that's in the grape juice and continues to put out more and more alcohol, after it reaches about 16%, the alcohol has a disinfectant property on the yeast, and it starts poisoning the yeast because its own environment from its own waste has become toxic. I do feel there's a metaphor there, but that's not what we're here to talk about today. The important part about knowing your ABV is that anything over about 10% alcohol, you're going to have to dilute before we can start the vinegar fermentation process. Much like the yeast being poisoned by the alcohol, the bacteria that we're going to introduce to convert the alcohol into acetic acid can also be poisoned by the alcohol levels. So once you get about 10%, you've got to dilute it. Once you get into the 18% or higher of the fortified wines that I mentioned, you'll have to dilute it almost 1-to-1 with water. At that point, your flavors, your character is so thinned out and anemic that it's just not going to be a delicious treat when you're done. So let's get started. I'm starting with 2 bottles of wine. You can use whatever quantity you want to start with. In this case, I'm just starting with 2 bottles. And we're going to need clean, filtered, unchlorinated water, or my personal preference is to use distilled water. We're going to dilute this in a 2-to-1 ratio. You're going to need a clean, either glass or ceramic vessel. In this case, this is a retired pickle jar. You're never going to want to use anything metal, because as you're creating the acid in the vinegar, the metal and the acid are going to react, and you're going to get chemicals leaching into your vinegar, which is not only unhealthy, but will leave you some very untasty results. You also don't want to use a plastic vat for fermentation, because that just gets stained and stinky and gross. Very important thing about your vessel is that it needs to have a wide open mouth. Winemaking with the fermentation of yeast is an anaerobic process, meaning it is not exposed to oxygen. However, the conversion of wine to vinegar is done with a bacteria that needs oxygen to survive. So you have to have something that has a very wide mouth for plenty of surface area to exchange air, meaning no sealed lids and definitely no one-way airlocks. It will not ferment. The other thing you're going to need for your first batch is a sample of the bacteria that is going to convert your wine into vinegar. There are dozens and dozens of bacteria that will do this job. Acetobacters, glucoacetobacters. I can't name all of them here, so please follow the link in the video if you're interested in learning more about the bacteria that does this. For now, the easiest way is to go to the store and buy yourself a bottle of living vinegar. Now, how you know this is living, first of all, organic is a good starter, but it says raw and unfiltered, or it says with the mother. In both cases, this means that the bacteria is still alive in this bottle. You do want to check the expiration date to make sure that it is still within the date. This gives you the tried and true bacteria that is always used in making commercial vinegars. When you're purchasing your living vinegar, a couple other clues to look for. This vinegar is very cloudy, and there's a little bit of sludge on the bottom. That precipitate at the bottom is part of the mother. The mother is what they call the bacterial colony that creates the vinegar. It's kind of like a SCOBY in kombucha, SCOBY standing for symbiotic colony of bacteria and yeast. The difference is that vinegar mother doesn't really have much yeast in it, so it's just a SCOB. When you open your wine, before you start pouring it into the fermentation vat, always grab a little glass, pour just a little out, and give it a sniff. Even if the wine is flawed, for instance, this one I know was stored incorrectly, it's still going to have some smell that's associated with wine, whether it's fruity or floral or herbaceous, oaky. Those are all normal scents that you would associate with wine. This one smells a little peppery. Sometimes you may find a wine that smells a little buttery. That is because a secondary fermentation that some winemakers do called malolactic fermentation, which is designed to turn the very tart malic acids into a very soft lactic acid, which is the same acid that you will find in milk and butter. Even if it smells buttery, that's fine. However, if you smell wet paper or wet cardboard, get rid of this wine. Dump it down the sink. That wine is not flawed, it is contaminated. There's a certain contamination called cork taint, which happens in approximately, they think, about 3% of wines in the world, when the wood that's used in the cork picks up a contaminant and then passes into the wine when the cork is placed into the bottle. Fortunately, some winemakers are starting to realize that this is a problem, and you may encounter wines that have screw tops on them or glass tops on them. Those are very rare. Sometimes you'll find corks that have plastic instead of wood. None of those have anything to worry about in terms of cork taint, because there's no actual wood to contaminate the wine. But in this case, this wine is good. So I'm going to start by pouring this into my vessel. Here's a little trick. If you give it a whirl, it dumps out a lot faster. Give it a whirl. And because we're diluting it at a 2-to-1 ratio, and I use 2 bottles of wine, the easiest way to measure it is pour 1 bottle of your filtered or distilled water. And there you have it. Wine is now diluted into a perfectly hospitable environment for your acetobacters. Give your wine a good shake to stir the mother up. And I'm going to pour maybe about 1/3 of this bottle into there. A good ratio would be as if you had a full gallon of wine diluted, maybe a cup or so per gallon. At this point, you're going to cover it lightly. You're going to cover this wine with something that allows for the required air exchange and also keep the dust and fruit flies out. A very important thing to remember is the bacteria that does this work is photosensitive. Keep it out of light. That's why I like to drape mine with a towel, or a ceramic crock will not let any light in. And you're going to store it someplace that stays at least room temperature or a little warmer. During the summer months, I have this lovely screened-in porch that I like to line my bottles up out of the sun and let them ferment and enjoy and thrive in the warm temperatures. A complete conversion of your wine to vinegar will take a minimum of 2 months in ideal conditions, or up to 6. Let's say it's about 2 months later. And it's time to check your vinegar to see how it's working. How do you know? Well, there's a couple different ways. The first thing, does it smell like vinegar? That's a good indication, but sometimes it might smell, instead of like vinegar, like nail polish. Well, if you think about it, acetone, acetic acid, they actually have a lot of similarities. And if it smells like nail polish remover, that just means fermentation is not complete. The acetone smell is step 1. It just needs a little more oxygen and a little more time. Another way, and one of the most important ways, is to look for the formation of the mother. Here is a jar of vinegar that's been fermenting for about 8 months now. And it has a very healthy, beautiful mother growing on the top. There's 2 main parts to a vinegar mother. On the top, you'll see a wet, leathery looking disc, which is a bacterial layer. It's all the bacteria that's converting your vinegar. It's very healthy. On the bottom, it's not very visible here, but remembering our commercial vinegar, on the bottom, there's a very sludgy layer. That is the microbial layer, also a part of the mother. Now, I know you're thinking, wait a minute, how come we only saw the sludgy microbial layer in the commercial vinegar? That's because of this cap here. This is preventing oxygen exchange, and that is preventing the full formation of the mother. However, while the commercial vinegar is not forming the bacterial layer of the mother at the top, you'll notice that this dispenser bottle does have one. It's sunk down to the bottom right here, and that's because this spout has a little cap that is not an airtight seal. That is enough oxygen exchange to keep the bacteria alive, to keep it converting your vinegar, and to keep it growing another mother layer. This is why it's very important to make sure that there's plenty of oxygen getting to your vinegar vat. The mother on the top, the bacterial layer, will keep growing, and it will float there until it gets too heavy and sinks down. And then another one will start forming. And if you leave that one in there, it will get too heavy and eventually sink down as well. There is no harm in leaving the mother in there. This is a vinegar that has been brewing and fermenting for about 3 years. There are at least 7 layers of vinegar mother in here. Absolutely no harm leaving it in there, but as you can see, it does take up a little room. So I'm going to take a few out just to create a little more room. I'm going to use metal tongs. I know I said not to use metal in fermentation, but this is going to be such a quick dip in and out that it's not going to have any time to actually react with the acid. Very gelatinous and gooey and friable, which means it likes to tear apart. 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And this is what a healthy, thriving, living vinegar mother looks like. Very gelatinous, very leathery, and very useful if you want to start another pot of vinegar. If you have a living mother, you don't have to use another sample of commercially made vinegar. You can create your diluted wine and just transfer this into it, and it carries all the healthy bacteria right into your new vat. Another thing you can do if you're interested in experimenting once you've gotten the hang of making vinegar is diluting your wine and just letting it sit in the air and catching the bacteria that it needs from the air. This is how the original vinegars were first made. Nobody went to the store and purchased a commercial bacteria to start their sample. They let it ferment naturally. I would recommend doing this a few times with commercial bacteria first, just to be sure that you are introducing the strongest, healthiest, correct bacteria first and giving it the best chance to survive and thrive before you start experimenting. But it's always worth it to see what kind of results you're going to get. But of course, there's always one tried and true way to make sure your vinegar is working. You need to refer to everybody's favorite scientific paper, litmus paper. Everybody pull out your 7th grade science and remember that pH is on a scale of 0 to 14, 7 being neutral. The further away you get towards 0, the stronger the acid, and the further away you go to 14, the stronger the base or alkaline. Every whole number away from 7 in either direction is 10 times stronger than the number before it. Vinegar usually is around a 3 to a 4 on the pH scale, meaning it's very low, it's very strong acid, usually about the same range as some of your stronger citric acids. I'm going to take the strip of pH paper and I'm just going to go ahead and drop it in here. I'm expecting this to be about a 3.5. This may be a little stronger just because this has been fermenting for a while. It is important to test this every once in a while because, like I said, when the wine is fermented into alcohol, it reaches a point where it's toxic to the yeast. Vinegar is the same way. If it reaches a certain level of about 3 on the pH scale, it becomes too acidic for the bacteria to continue to live. So it should be ready now. So let's take a look and see what we have. Here is our testing strip. And we're just going to compare it to the colors. That is actually closer to a 3. So this is some pretty strong vinegar. At a pH of about 3, it's getting a little too inhospitable for the bacteria to continue living. Easiest solution for that is just to feed it with some more diluted wine and water. That gives it something to continue to eat and brings the pH out of the danger zone. You have some lovely vinegar that you're ready to cook with. It makes beautiful salad dressings. It brightens up a beef stew. It puts an extra layer of flavor onto a pot of pulled pork. But the very important thing to remember is this is not certified safe for canning recipes or any recipe that requires a minimum guaranteed acidity level. While I can measure the pH, I can't really look at this and say, is this 4.5% or is it 5% acid? Canning recipes need a minimum of 5. You can't guarantee this. Do not use it in canning. And now that I've removed all of the additional mother layer discs out of this jar, that's how much vinegar I had left. So while it is perfectly acceptable to leave the mothers in there, it does take up a lot of space.
After combining the in-progress white wine vinegars,
And that just splashed in my eye.
and splashing herself in the eye, Shonna covered her vinegar vats and left them to continue their wine to vinegar process. Thanks for watching. Until next time, be curious, keep an open mind, and never stop learning.